This morning I'd like to talk about how to be confident in a crisis or in crisis. And my family knows this. I am not the most apt to tell somebody how to be confident, how to be brave. If you know me at all, confidence is not my strength. But worldly confidence isn't exactly what I'm talking about. The Bible teaches that there are three kinds of storms or three types of crises in our life. Storms that we bring on ourselves, such as, for example, Samson and his self-induced troubles, and storms that God causes, for example, a physical storm like on the Lake of Galilee with Jesus, or trouble or tests in your life. Storms, and then the third kind is storms that other people cause, such as Paul and Silas being thrown into prison. The last kind of storm is especially hard to take when you're the victim of somebody else. Storms don't exactly play favorites, and neither does God. Christians experience storms, the world experiences storms. Everybody has their own problems, and the Bible says, yet a man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. And that's a passage out of Job. So how do we deal with these crises? How do you stay calm and maintain your confidence and your courage in the midst of a crisis? We're going to look at a story in the Bible that deals with crisis. It's the story of Paul's journey to Rome. If you will turn to Acts 27. Acts chapter 27. And let's start in verse 7 of Acts chapter 27. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. Passing it with great difficulty, we came to a place called... Now when much time had been spent, and sailing now was dangerous, because the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete open, and winter there. When the south wind blew softly, supposing they had obtained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose, called Euroclydon. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. When they had taken it on board, they used cables to undergird the ship, and fearing lest it sands, they struck sail, and so were driven. And because we were exceedingly tempest-tossed, the next day they lightened the ship. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. But after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, Men, you should have and incurred this disaster and loss. Now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God to whom I belong, or of the God to whom I belong, and whom I serve, saying, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed God has granted you all those who sail with you. Therefore take heart, men, for I believe God as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little farther they took soundings again, and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. So in this story, he's journeying to Rome, he's on a ship, he's a prisoner, he's being escorted by a centurion, likely many soldiers there, escorting him to Rome along with other prisoners. Part of the journey was on ship, as we see, most of it was on a ship, and on their journey they had come to an island called Crete and a harbor called Fair Havens. That sounds like a nice place to stay. But it says that this place wasn't fair to winter in. It wasn't a good place to stay for the winter. And if you know anything about sailing, there's certain seasons, certain times throughout the year that it's good to sail. Other times it's not a good idea to sail, especially back then with wooden boats, small ships. And as it says here, the season for sailing was past. The weather was changing. And Paul gave his opinion, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and loss, not only of cargo and ship, but also our lives." He told the sailors, "Guys, I don't think it's a good idea to sail right now. I think it's dangerous to sail. You could lose the cargo, and we could all die." But they decided to sail anyway. Anyways, a bad decision was made. Why? I think there's 3 common reasons that people make any bad decision. It happens today. It happened 2,000 years ago. People are going to make bad decisions. Human nature does not change. The first reason that people make bad decisions is bad advice from experts. Centurion was more persuaded by the pilot, by the helmsman, and the owner of the ship than what was being said by Paul. The helmsman is the man who, like it says, pilots the ship. He steers the ship. So, as a helmsman, you have to be knowledgeable about the ocean, about how to drive a ship, or how to pilot a ship. And the captain, the owner of the ship, was in charge. He likely knows a lot about sailing, especially in that area. But the centurion listened to them instead of this prisoner, this man who he likely didn't know a whole lot about. So instead of listening to what Paul said, he followed the advice of the pilot and the captain. The first reason we get ourselves into a mess is we listen to the wrong experts. There's a lot of crazy ideas out there in the world, and it seems everybody wants to give you their idea of advice, their idea of wisdom. And it takes a lot of real wisdom, a lot of spiritual wisdom to sort through it all. But listen to what the Bible says. In Proverbs 4:13, the writer there says, Take firm hold of instruction. Do not let go. Keep her, for she is your life. Good advice is godly advice. Consider the source of your advice. If you're getting some advice, don't just take it for granted. Look at the source, study the source, and look at God, and try to figure out if it's sound, good advice. The second reason people make bad decisions is the wrong perception of the circumstances. Those who were with Paul looked at the circumstances. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, and they didn't want to stay there. It didn't seem like a good place to stay for the winter. And then, when the south wind blew softly, supposing they had attained their desire, putting out to sea, they sailed close by Crete. And it says that there was a south wind. Some translations call it a moderate south wind, and others say a gentle southerly breeze. That sounds like a great time to be sailing, sail on a cruise through the Mediterranean. And so these sailors, they have this nice, gentle breeze, and they think it's a great time to go ahead and set sail. If we sail right now, we'll make it to the next harbor. So all their circumstances looked favorable. But let me ask you, how often have you ever seen the weather in the morning is sunny, it's nice, and by the end of the day, it's storming? I think that's especially a problem here in the South. Our weather can change like that. And ocean weather, the weather out on the sea, is even more notorious for its spontaneity. It can be raining, pouring, and then suddenly it's nice and sunny, not a cloud in the sky, and then again it's storming again. But despite that, it's crazy to ignore what God says, what somebody like Paul, who gets everything he says from God. It's crazy to ignore what he says, even if the circumstances tend to contradict it. Things may look good right now, but you could be sailing straight into a storm. I've heard people say, well, this decision must be okay because I feel so good about it. I feel like this is the right thing to do. Let me ask you, do your feelings change? Do you ever wake up one morning and you don't think the same about something? Or your whole life, do you think the same things about everything? Do you feel the same way about everything? If that were true, I think humans would be a very boring kind of people. If you always feel the same way about this shirt and bow tie as you do 30 years from now. So if God says wait in the harbor, you'd probably be best if you wait in the harbor. It's not going to matter or it should not matter what the circumstances say. And the third reason people make bad decisions is they follow the crowd. And I think my generation has a huge problem with that. The scriptures say, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. So that's probably not talking about the prisoners on the ship. It's likely talking about the sailors, the pilot, the captain, the centurion, the people who had experience, but they all voted to go out to sea, to go ahead and move on to the next port. And the fact is that the majority is very often wrong. Do you remember what happened when Moses first started to lead the children of Israel? The majority wanted to go back to Egypt. They wanted to go back where it was nice and comfy. You got food at least. You didn't have to walk and wander in the wilderness. But obviously they were wrong. We can get ourselves into a real mess by following the prevailing opinion. If we followed the prevailing opinion today, I think we would be making a lot more mistakes in our lives. Or the most popular idea. But not only can we make the wrong decisions, we can also make the wrong moves. And I'd like to propose that there's also 3 wrong moves that you can make in a crisis. Once you're in a crisis, there's always decisions that you have to make. There's moves you have to make to get out of that storm. You're not just going to sit there and take it. You're going to do something, whether you do the right thing or the wrong thing. And when we're caught in a crisis, we typically do these 3 things. The same 3 things that the sailors did. Their reactions are typical for people under pressure. The first one is they were driven. In verse 15 it says, so when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. They just gave up control. They just let the ship be taken by the wind, by the currents, by the waves, and they just let it drive. The first thing that storms tend to do is drive our lives. We get pushed around. We forget where we're headed. We let go of our goals. We forget the values, and we're driven by fear, by panic. Because they didn't have compasses in those days, and because the stars were completely obscured by the storm, they were likely in total darkness. It doesn't say whether it was day or night, but since it points out these stars and sun had not been seen, it was dark. Imagine black clouds, and out at sea there's not city lights, there's not torches, things like that. You can have torches out on a boat when it's raining. So they're in complete darkness when it came to this storm. They were being driven by the storm, and they didn't have any idea where they were headed. All they could see all around them likely was water, storm, lightning, thunder, clouds. And so if you don't know where you're going, what are you to do? So you let the crisis drive you. You let the storm drive you. You just let the waves beat you back and forth because of these strong currents in your life. And you feel like saying, what's the use? Why fight it? I'll just go with the flow. I'll try to ride the storm and let it pass. But that's not all. The next point is discarding. In verses 18 and 19 we find, of chapter 27, the next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle. We threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. They took the tackle of the ship. They took the ropes, the things to tie things down, the sails, and just tossed them overboard. And they had already jettisoned the cargo. They had already taken their food, their supplies, and tossed it overboard. Ships did that to make it lighter so they would float more on top of, if I'm understanding it right, to float more on top of the waves, so you wouldn't be as swayed by the waves. You were less likely to be. Comes in our lives, we are first driven by the crisis, and then we start throwing things out, discarding things in our lives. With the sailors, the first to go was the cargo, and then the ship's tackle. Later on, in verse 38, it talks about the grain, and finally, they wanted to throw the prisoners overboard to go ahead and kill them. And eventually they jumped overboard to swim ashore. The point is this: often when we get into a crisis, we're tempted to throw out the things that are very important to us, the values that we've hung on to. we have a tendency just to throw everything out because we're under pressure and we want to get rid of it all. We want to be impulsive. We become impulsive. We give up on our dreams. We run out on relationships. We throw away values that we learned even as children. But that's not all. The third point is we become despairing. In verse 20 we find it says, "Now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up." In extreme crisis, we eventually get to the point of despair, and we give up all hope. The last thing we throw out when we've got a problem is hope. And then when we've thrown that away, we've reached the absolute bottom of the barrel. The sailors were 14 days in total darkness in a little ship in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. They didn't have the big cruise ships, the big cargo ships. This boat that they were on was likely tiny to any ship that we would think of today. And it was a wooden ship that would have been weak compared to a lot of boats that we have. It actually says the running cords underneath the ship. That was because they were afraid the bottom of the ship would just bust open. So the cords were trying to hold the ship together. Imagine being that afraid of a storm, of any crisis, that you're trying to just hold everything together, hold your life together. They'd been bashed back and forth by a storm till they threw out everything and gave up all hope. Perhaps you feel like that right now, or any time during a storm. You've been going through a problem the past week, the past month, the past year, and it's been batting you back and forth, and you've come to the point of despair. What's the use? There's no hope. This is an impossible situation. But that's not the end of the story. There was still hope because Paul was there and God was still there. And there's 4 ways to be confident in a crisis, to be confident in the midst of the storm. The amazing part of the story is Paul's reaction. It's completely different from the attitude of the sailors. The sailors were down and discouraged and terrified, and they're at the end of their rope. To them, everything looked hopeless. But Paul, in the midst of the storm, was calm and confident. He's got the courage in the crisis. He's staying cool in the midst of this hot mess, this storm. The sailors' reactions were their natural responses to the crisis. That's how, honestly, a lot of people would react if they were the ones out there on that ship. But Paul's reaction was supernatural, you could say. He knows where he is. He knows he's out on this storm. He knows the physical danger, but he also knows where God is. He also knows that God is there. One test of our Christianity is how we handle a crisis. Anybody can call themselves a Christian when things are going great, when life is sailing smooth. But what happens when things are going bad, when things are falling apart? When crisis meets you head on, when you sail straight into a storm? Do you cling to Christ at the time of crisis? Problems are a testing of our faith. When the problems come, we're tempted to despair, to drift, to be driven by circumstances, or to throw everything overboard. Character is revealed in a crisis, not made in a crisis. Character is made in the day-by-day, mundane, trivial things in life, the routine. Character is made in the everyday, but it's revealed when we get into a shipwreck, when we're in the midst of a storm, into a situation that threatens to swallow us up. What would you do, or what should you do, when things look like they're falling apart and the ship's falling apart under your feet? What should you do when you're being battered by the problems in life? Look at what the sailors did. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. The safest thing to do when you get in a storm is to drop your anchors. Put your anchors down. Just stay where you are, stand still, get a grip on the situation. Situations change, circumstances change. Crisis comes and crisis goes. Just wait it out. The Bible says in Psalms 125, "Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever." Often when people encounter a major problem, they want to change everything in their lives. They're uncomfortable with where they're at, they're uncomfortable with a relationship or their job, and so they want to move. No one wants to stay in an uncomfortable situation. But when a crisis comes, it usually comes with change, and it's not a good idea to add more change to it. What they need to do is put down the anchors and get some stability. So why was Paul able to stay confident in crisis? Because he remembered these 4 things, 4 fundamental principles that we should all remember when crisis comes. They became anchors in his life, and they can be anchors for our life too. The first one is remember God's presence. Remember where God is at. And the first anchor in a crisis is the presence of God. In the midst of the storm, Paul says, "And now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve." Here's a fact. The storms of life don't keep God away from our door. We may not see him, but he sees us. We may think he's a million, billion miles away, but he's right there watching us, and he is with us. God promises in the scriptures, in Hebrews 13, verse 5, "I will never leave nor forsake you." Over and over, the Bible says that wherever we are, God is right there with us. I never go through anything all by myself, because God is always with me. No matter what situation you're going through right now or ever, God is with you. He's the anchor that you can completely trust. The second point is, remember God's purpose. The second anchor is found in Acts 27:24, where he says, "Do not be afraid, Paul." This is what the angel said to Paul. "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar, and indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you." God told Paul, "I have a plan for you. I have a plan for your life. My plan is that you go before Caesar, that you go to Rome. My plan is that you're going to preach in the court of Caesar. I have a purpose for your life that is greater than this little storm you're in." Every Christian ought to have a sense of destiny. No person is really born by accident. God has a plan and purpose for your life. You're not here just to take up space, and you're not just here to breathe our oxygen. Storms may come and storms may go, but God has a purpose for your life. Absolutely nothing can change God's ultimate purpose for your life unless you choose to disobey him. If you choose to reject his plan, he'll allow you to do that. He'll allow you to make the choice to ride this storm to wherever it goes. He'll let you do that. But the Bible teaches that no outside person can change God's plan for you. Some outside person can't come in and dictate what God is planning for you, what God is going to have you do in your life if you choose to obey him. God leaves that up to you. He can either accept, or you can either accept it, or you can reject it. But no matter what happens on the outside, external forces cannot alter God's purpose for your life. The purpose of God is greater than any situation that you will ever experience. God has a plan beyond the problems you're facing right now. And again, you have the decision to make there, whether you accept the plan or reject the plan. But you should know this. Even if you reject his plan for you, he has a bigger plan than that. You aren't going to ruin God's ultimate plan. So even if that was your goal, even if you were so evil to think that you were trying to ruin God's plan, only you can only change the plan for you, and nobody else can change the plan for you. And then there's the bigger picture of God's ultimate plan. And the third anchor is to remember God's promise. The third anchor that gives us confidence can be found in verse 25. "Therefore, take heart, men, for I believe God that it will be just as it was told me." The third anchor is to remember his promise. Does God always keep his promises? We know that he does. He never fails. Storms and other crises can distract us, things that make us focus on the less important things, focus on our lives. But God is always there, and he always keeps his promises. Some of you may be going through a crisis right now. Your problems may seem overwhelming. You think you're going to drown. But let's say this. God is watching over you. You may lose the cargo, you may lose the tackle, you may even lose your ship. And you may fall in, you may get wet, you may ruin your nice clothes, but you're going to make it because of the promise of God. If you just put your faith in God, he will carry you through. And then the fourth anchor, as we conclude today, is to remember to pray. What should we do while we're waiting for God to fulfill his promise? Pray. Talk to God. Tell him your feelings. Tell him your fears. Tell him that you trust him. Tell him that you're afraid. Tell him that you're worried that you're not going to make it. The storms of life will come and go. They cannot keep you from talking to God. It's not like a satellite connection where some clouds in the way are going to interrupt that connection. You may be going through some difficult times right now, but God has a purpose for your life. There's a reason for it all, and you're going to make it safely to land as long as you trust in God.